Dinosaurs ruled the Earth for over 160 million years, evolving into some of the most terrifying, bizarre, and massive creatures to ever exist. But they all had to start somewhere. Today, I'm breaking down every major dinosaur family and everything that made them unique, starting with the ones that kicked it all off. Herrerasauridae. 233 million years ago in what is now Argentina, something new appeared, something the world had never seen before. Herrerasaurus was roughly 6 meters long, 350 kilograms, built for bipedal pursuit with curved claws and a long counterbalancing tail. It looked like a predator that owned its environment, but it didn't. Here's the thing. Dinosaurs were nobodies at this point. Herrerasaurid fossils represent only about 10% of animal diversity at their locality. Larger reptiles like Saurosuchus were the actual apex predators, and Herrerasaurids were likely on the menu. The earliest dinosaurs weren't kings, they were survivors, and what makes Herrerasauridae genuinely fascinating is that scientists still can't agree on what they actually are. Depending on the analysis, they're either basal theropods, basal saurischians, or a lineage that split off before modern Dinosauria even existed. They had only 2 sacral vertebrae, the lowest count of any dinosaur, and 5 metacarpals in the hand. A bizarre mosaic of primitive and advanced traits that breaks every clean classification. Coprolites associated with their remains contain small bones but zero plant material, confirming these were committed meat eaters with bone digesting capability. They were effective hunters, just not the dominant ones. By the end of the Carnian stage, they were gone, replaced by the rising diversity of later theropod lineages, the very animals they may have been ancestral to. Think of Herrerasaurids as the first draft of dinosaurs. Powerful enough to survive, but living in a world that didn't belong to them yet. But the next family, they started changing that. Coelophysidae. Coelophysis might be the scrappiest dinosaur that ever lived. 2 meters long, 27 kilograms soaking wet, and surrounded by phytosaurs and Rauisuchids that could swallow it whole. But this little predator didn't just survive the late Triassic, it thrived across multiple continents for over 35 million years, and the name means hollow form, and that tells you everything about how it pulled this off. Its limb bones were tubular and filled with air, cutting body weight dramatically and turning it into one of the fastest, most agile hunters of its era. The skull was narrow and elongated, roughly 270 millimeters long, with large forward-facing eyes built for stereoscopic vision. This thing was designed to track and catch small, fast prey with surgical precision. Around 26 upper teeth and 27 lower teeth, all blade-like, recurved and serrated. The forelimbs had excellent range of motion but modest muscle power, meaning Coelophysis wasn't wrestling anything its own size it didn't need to, but here's where it gets wild. At Ghost Ranch, New Mexico, paleontologists found over 1,000 Coelophysis specimens in a single rock layer. 1,000. It's one of the most extraordinary fossil concentrations ever discovered, likely a mass death event at a drying water source or a catastrophic flash flood. And that famous claim about Coelophysis being cannibals, juvenile bones found inside an adult's ribcage, re-examination proved those bones belonged to small crocodilians, not baby Coelophysis. Science correcting itself in real time. But if you think small and scrappy defines the Triassic, the next family went in the complete opposite direction. Plateosauridae. Plateosaurus might be the most underrated dinosaur ever discovered because this animal broke every rule about what a single species is supposed to look like. One fully grown adult could be 4.8 meters long and weigh 600 kilograms. Another fully grown adult of the exact same species, 10 meters and 4,000 kilograms. That's the difference between a large horse and a small elephant. Same animal, same species, just extreme developmental plasticity on a level we almost never see, and these weren't some obscure footnote in dinosaur history. Plateosaurids were among the first large herbivores to ever exist, filling the big plant-eater niche across Central and Northern Europe roughly 214 to 204 million years ago, long before the true sauropods took over. Their anatomy was purpose-built for eating plants. Small skull sitting on a long neck neck made of 10 vertebrae, hind limbs way longer than the forelimbs, and a massive tail with at least 40 vertebrae for balance. They could rear up on 2 legs to reach higher vegetation. The teeth were leaf-shaped with blunt serrations, up to 30 per jaw, and the jaw joint sat low relative to the tooth row, creating a lever system that gave them serious crushing power against tough cycads and conifers. But here's where it gets really interesting. Bone analysis reveals these animals grew at rapid, mammal-like rates, and their internal bone microstructure is consistent with avian-style air sac lungs, meaning these Triassic herbivores already had elevated metabolisms and were far more bird-like than anyone expected. Dozens of complete skeletons have been found across Western Europe, often clustered together, suggesting they moved in groups like these animals were the proof of concept, the evolutionary template that said herbivory works at massive scale. But if you think Plateosaurus was big, wait until you meet the family that took that same blueprint and stretched it to absolutely absurd proportions. Diplodocidae. Diplodocus is one of the longest animals to ever walk the earth, and its tail might have been able to break the sound barrier. Let me explain. Diplodocus carnegie stretched 24 to 26 meters long, but here's the thing. It was surprisingly light for a sauropod. We're talking 12 to 14.8 metric tons. That's massive by any normal standard, but compared to the tank-like brachiosaurs sharing the same Morrison Formation environment, Diplodocus was built like a greyhound, long, slender, and agile, and the partial Diplodocus halorum specimen pushes those numbers even further, with revised estimates placing it somewhere between 29 and 33.5 meters long. But the real showstopper is the tail. Over 55% of the animal's total body length was tail, roughly 80 caudal vertebrae tapering down to a thin, flexible whip. Early biomechanical simulations suggested that this tail could generate tip velocities exceeding the speed of sound, producing a crack like a biological bullwhip capable of disorienting predators or signaling rivals across enormous distances. But more recent studies have pushed back hard, finding the tail structure likely couldn't withstand supersonic forces without breaking apart. The debate is still ongoing, but either way, that tail was a serious weapon. Now the feeding system is where it gets genuinely weird. Diplodocus had pencil-shaped teeth only at the very front of its mouth. No chewing, no grinding. Wear patterns show damage concentrated on the labial surface, the outer lip-facing side, which tells us exactly what it was doing. Unilateral branch stripping, one tooth row grabbed and stripped leaves, while the opposite row stabilized the branch. The elongated skull let it engage longer stem segments, and the lower jaw could actually shift backward mid-strip to adjust alignment in real time. And the teeth replaced every 35 days or fewer, with up to 5 replacement teeth stacked inside each socket at any given time. A literal conveyor belt of teeth running non-stop throughout its entire life. But if Diplodocus was the long, lean browser of the Morrison Formation, the next family took the exact opposite approach to eating. By Brachiosauridae, every dinosaur family has a body plan that solves a specific problem. Brachiosauridae solved the problem of being enormous, and the solution is one of the most impressive pieces of biological engineering in the history of life on Earth. Here's what makes brachiosaurs immediately different from almost every other dinosaur. Their forelimbs were longer than their hind limbs. That's the opposite of the standard dinosaur blueprint. This gave them a steeply inclined trunk and a neck that rose nearly vertically, like a living construction crane. While diplodocids from the same time period went long and low, sweeping their necks horizontally to cover ground, brachiosaurs went straight up. Same era, same environment, completely different engineering approach to being gigantic. And gigantic is an understatement. The Brachiosaurus holotype, which was only a subadult, has mass estimates ranging from 28.3 to 46.9 metric tons. At the upper end, that's among the heaviest animals to ever walk on land. But here's the thing, an animal that heavy shouldn't be able to hold a neck that long in the air. The skeleton solves this with pneumatization. Air sacs from the pulmonary system bored directly into the vertebrae and ribs, hollowing out bone material and drastically reducing density. This is the same system modern birds use. It's the only reason a 40-ton animal could support that neck without collapsing. The forelimbs had a slight outward splay at the shoulder, meaning the front legs bore a larger share of body weight than in other sauropods. The humerus alone was roughly 216 centimeters long, but only 28.5 centimeters wide at its thinnest point. Between the third and fifth dorsal vertebrae, both Brachiosaurus and its close relative Giraffatitan likely had a shoulder hump where elongated vertebral processes anchored the massive neck muscles. And that deep rib cage, required to house the enlarged digestive system, needed to fuel a 40-ton body every single day. But if you think massive plant-eating tanks are impressive, wait until you see the dinosaur family that turned defense into an art form. Stegosaurus is one of the most recognizable dinosaurs ever, and almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. Those iconic plates running down its back, you saw they weren't paired. No two plates from a single individual are identical in size or shape. The symmetrical, matched pair image you've seen in every museum gift shop illustration is a myth. They alternated, staggered along the spine from neck to tail. So what were they actually for? Here's the thing. Those plates are riddled with vascular grooves on their surfaces, indicating dense networks of blood vessels running through them. That's strong evidence for thermoregulation, basically giant biological radiators. The alternating layout maximizes surface area for heat exchange with the surrounding air. But there's a competing theory that they existed primarily for species recognition and display. And honestly, both could be true simultaneously. What we know for certain is that they made terrible armor. They're thin in cross-section and leave the entire flank completely exposed. An Allosaurus wouldn't even need to get past them, but Stegosaurus wasn't defenseless, not even close. The Thagomizer, 4 massive tail spikes, was a genuine weapon, and I can prove it. There's a healed puncture wound on an Allosaurus tail vertebra that matches Stegosaurus spike morphology exactly. That's direct forensic evidence of one animal injuring another 150 million years ago. A successful counterattack preserved in bone. What made the Thagomizer so effective is something most people never consider. Stegosaurid tails lacked the ossified tendons found in most ornithischians, giving them unusual lateral flexibility. Biomechanical analysis shows a Stegosaurus could swing its rear end sideways while keeping its hind feet planted, precisely targeting threats approaching from the side, a fundamentally slow, heavily built herbivore that survived by being genuinely dangerous at close range. But if Stegosaurus was built like a slow tank with a weapon on the back end, wait until you see the family that took the armored herbivore concept and turned it up to an absolutely ridiculous degree. Ankylosauridae. Ankylosaurus is one of the most famous dinosaurs on the planet, and we don't even have a complete skeleton. Let that sink in. Most of what we know about this animal comes from fragmentary armor plates, isolated bones, and a tail club that wasn't even discovered until well after the initial description. An 8-meter, 8,000 kilogram living fortress, and we're still piecing it together like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. But here's the thing. We don't need a complete Ankylosaurus because we have Zool, Zool cruravastator, pulled from Montana's Judith River Formation, is one of the most beautifully preserved ankylosaurs ever found. Skin and bony armor across the entire back and flanks, all intact. This specimen shows us exactly what these animals looked like in life. The tail alone is roughly 3 meters long, lined with lateral spikes, the back half completely stiffened, and the end capped with enormous bony clubs, forming what is essentially a biological sledgehammer. Now, everyone assumes that tail club evolved to smash Tyrannosaur shins. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets complicated. Multiple hip spikes on Zool have missing tips with healed bone surface. The damage pattern is consistent with lateral impacts from other ankylosaurids, not predator bites. These animals were fighting each other. The current evidence points to sexual selection and male-male combat as the primary driver behind the tail club's evolution. The club only appears in derived species. It develops during growth in a way consistent with sexually selected traits, and the trauma patterns line up perfectly with ritualized dominance fights. This wasn't a predator defense weapon first, it was a mating weapon, and despite all that armor covering the back and sides, the belly and lower legs were largely unprotected. They had to be. is these animals needed roughly 60 kilograms of vegetation daily, comparable to a modern elephant, processed through tiny grinding teeth. Full coverage would have made feeding impossible. But if you think a walking tank with a sledgehammer tail is intimidating, wait until you meet the apex predator that ruled an entire era before tyrannosaurs even existed. Allosauridae. Allosaurus wasn't just a predator, it was the predator. The single most common large carnivore in the entire Morrison Formation, active from 155 to 145 million years ago, and so successful that its fossils outnumber every other large theropod from the late Jurassic combined. This animal owned the period, and it was built for exactly that. Allosaurus fragilis averaged 8.5 meters long, with documented maximums around 9.7 meters and a mass between 2.3 and 2.7 metric tons. Now, older literature throws around claims of 12 to 13 meter individuals, but those remain controversial. The largest confirmed specimen, AMNH 680, falls well short of those figures. What we can verify is already terrifying enough. The skull is where things get interesting. It was light and robust at the same time, packed with large fenestrae that reduced mass, while the bone itself stayed thick enough to handle the stresses of attacking multi-ton sauropods. Short, thick neck built on 9 vertebrae, long muscular tail for counterbalance, powerful forelimbs ending in 3 curved claws with a semi-lunate carpal bone, a wrist feature that would keep evolving in theropods all the way to modern birds. But here's where it gets really cool. Growth analysis shows Allosaurus hit its maximum growth rate at around 15 years old, with skeletal deposition stopping between 22 and 28 years. That means scientists can literally read individual life stories from the bone, and those bones tell a fascinating story. Juveniles had proportionally longer shins and feet than thighs, leg ratios built for speed, for chasing down small prey. Adults had the exact reverse, slower, more powerful locomotion scaled to taking on sauropods. A juvenile Allosaurus and an adult Allosaurus were functionally different predators, and about that apex predator title. Quarry taphonomy from the Morrison Formation shows Allosaurus consuming sauropod carcasses at every stage of decomposition. Freshly killed, partially rotted, heavily decayed. This animal ate whatever was available without hesitation. Noble apex predator, more like the Jurassic's most efficient opportunist, but if Allosaurus ruled the Jurassic, the Cretaceous had something even bigger waiting in the wings: Tyrannosauridae. The largest confirmed Tyrannosaurus specimen, nicknamed Scotty, measures 13 meters long and weighs approximately 9 metric tons. Let that sink in. And Scotty wasn't even typical. Most adults averaged around 12.3 meters and 7 to 8 metric tons, which already makes them the largest bipedal predator to ever exist on this planet. Nothing else comes close. But here's the thing. The size isn't even the most impressive part. The growth curve is. Tyrannosaurus stayed relatively small for most of its life, sitting under 1.8 metric tons at age 14. Then something insane kicked in. These animals packed on roughly 600 kilograms per year for 4 consecutive years, reaching full adult mass in their early 20s. That's one of the fastest documented growth spurts in any vertebrate ever. Imagine gaining over half a ton annually, every year, for 4 years straight. Now let's talk about that skull. The cranial architecture of Tyrannosaurus is an engineering contradiction. The bones were fused and reinforced specifically for absorbing massive impact forces, but at the same time, the skull was riddled with hollow chambers and large fenestrae to keep the overall weight manageable. Strength and maneuverability working against each other and somehow both winning, and the bite force backs it up. Liquido estimates range from 35,000 to 63,332 newtons depending on the methodology used. That's enough to pulverize bone entirely, and we know they did exactly that because fossilized coprolites contain crushed bone fragments. They weren't just killing prey, they were eating the skeleton, now the arms. Everyone jokes about them, but the muscular attachment sites indicate genuine functional strength. they weren't vestigial. They just became increasingly irrelevant when you're attached to a skull that can generate 60,000 newtons of force. The whole body plan concentrated mass into the head and legs, with the postcranial skeleton optimized for low rotational inertia. That means faster directional changes than an animal that size has any right to make. Tarbosaurus, its closest confirmed relative, shares the same crescent-shaped post-orbital crest and cranial sutural patterns, cementing them as sister taxa. But if Tyrannosaurus represents the peak of large predator evolution, the next family took a completely different approach to killing. Smaller, faster, and armed with something arguably more terrifying than a 13-meter jaw. Dromaeosauridae. Forget everything Jurassic Park taught you. Dromaeosaurids weren't scaled-up lizards. They were feathered, bird-like predators with forward-facing eyes, S-curved necks, short, deep torsos, and long arms that folded against the body. Chinese fossil specimens preserve the integumentary detail clearly. These animals had true feathers. They were closer relatives of modern birds than Tyrannosaurus ever was. Think bird of prey, not monster lizard, and that iconic sickle claw on the second toe. It wasn't a slashing weapon, I know. Decades of movies and documentaries told you these things disemboweled prey with one kick. But current biomechanical analysis tells a completely different story. The claw was a grasping and climbing tool used to pin prey under body weight rather than slice open abdomens. The hunting strategy has a name: raptor prey restraint. Leap onto the target, pin it with body weight, and foot claws grip tightly and deliver killing bites. The exact same strategy used by modern eagles and hawks, and that's not a loose comparison. The feet and legs of dromaeosaurs are the closest morphological analogs to accipitrid raptors in the entire fossil record. Take Deinonychus, about precision engineering for a predator that hunted while standing on top of its food. But here's where it gets genuinely touching. Utah raptor specimens have been found ranging from tiny 3-foot juveniles all the way to full-size adults, all preserved together. Whether they died at the same time is still debated, but the association suggests gregarious behavior and possibly post-nestling parental care. Families of feathered killers raising their young together. But if you think sharp claws and feathers are impressive defensive tools, wait until you see what happens when a herbivore decides to grow an entire shield on its face. Yeah. Almost every ceratopsid ever discovered comes from one place, one landmass. The island continent of Laramedia, which was western North America during the Upper Cretaceous, with rare exceptions like Sinoceratops from late Cretaceous China. This entire family, dozens of species, evolved and diversified on a single strip of land, and somehow they became one of the most diverse dinosaur families ever. Triceratopsidae. The ceratopsids split into two subfamilies with completely different strategies. The Chasmosaurinae, which includes the Triceratops lineage, developed long triangular frills and massive brow horns. The Centrosaurini, think Styracosaurus, went the opposite direction with shorter rectangular frills covered in elaborate posterior spines and dominant nasal horns. Two solutions to the same evolutionary pressures running in parallel on the same continent. But let's talk about the one everyone came here for. Triceratops measured 8 to 9 meters long and weighed between 6 and 10 metric tons. Its skull alone reached up to 2.5 meters, making it one of the largest skulls of any land animal that has ever existed. Two brow horns roughly 1 meter long, one shorter nasal horn, a solid bony frill lacking the fenestrae found in many relatives, providing maximum coverage over the neck and shoulders, exactly the spots a large predator would target from behind, and we have proof those horns weren't just for show. Healed bite marks on Triceratops skulls match Tyrannosaurus tooth dimensions perfectly. These animals were bitten by the most powerful predator on the planet and survived. The three horns in that massive skull were functional weapons with documented use. Here's the thing though. Ontogenetic analysis shows the horns and frills grew disproportionately larger as individuals matured, reaching maximum size only in full adults. That's the signature of sexual selection. defense mattered, but signaling to rivals and mates was likely the primary driver. These weren't solitary animals either. Ceratopsid fossil deposits contain enormous numbers of single-species individuals, evidence of herding behavior, possibly seasonal migrations tracking rainfall between coastal and inland habitats. Their dental batteries, rows of small shearing teeth, processed tough vegetation at ground level, specialized, efficient, and built for volume. Then 66 million years ago, it all ended. The Chicxulub asteroid struck with a force of roughly 100 million megatons. Approximately 75% of all species on Earth were wiped out in the aftermath. Every ceratopsid, every tyrannosaurid, every sauropod, every ankylosaur, every non-avian dinosaur lineage, gone. The only dinosaurs that survived were the ones that had already learned to fly. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.